Welcome to the SSI Orbit podcast, a forum where we explore the ever-growing ecosystems of self-sovereign identity. And I'm your host, Mathieu Glaude. In this conversation, I talked to Jimmy, co-founder and CEO of Tykn. Jimmy is a social entrepreneur, and through Tykn, they're helping solve problems for people that have become political refugees and have lost their identities, which really limits so many opportunities in their lives. So in this conversation, Jimmy and I discuss how his background in crypto led him towards understanding and being excited about decentralized identity for social impact. We discussed how he got into SSI by being a founding steward of Sovereign. We discussed him launching Tykn to help refugees and people that lost their identities by working with the Turkish government to help issue work permit documents to their Syrian refugee population. We discuss user experience design and Tykn's approach to SSI wallets and enterprise applications. Now, I very much enjoyed this conversation with Jimmy. I think we could have spent many more hours together talking about this stuff. I hope you enjoy it just as much as I did. Without further ado, here's the conversation with Jimmy. Okay, we're live. Jimmy, thank you for doing this with me.
Thank you for having me on. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, I've been looking forward to this too. I think we're doing some cool stuff in the self-sovereign identity space, and we'll get to that in a few minutes. I was curious just off the bat. I know you come from the crypto space. You're very into the crypto space. Seems like a lot of people in the self-sovereign identity community kind of come from crypto. There's a lot of people in the self-sovereign identity community that try to distance themselves from crypto, but there is some tie. So did you come from the crypto space?
I'd say technically yes, although at this point in time, all of that is very nuanced. It's logical that a lot have come from crypto because, you know, the whole idea of decentralization and everything, it's kind of the same mentality that's carried over. But then also I tried to segregate it a lot because, you know, we'll get more into that on the SSI part of things, where I think it's, you know, good that crypto and SSI has been kind of parting ways a bit. But yeah, technically I've come in through the crypto space. I entered that into like 2015, 2016 through Bitcoin and then Ether, mostly just being super interested in the technology and just, you know, geeking out, diving into it. And then at some point, I met my co-founders from Tykn, and they kind of came from the same space, and we saw this big identity problem, and then thought, okay, you know, can we marry this idea of decentralization with the problem of identity and privacy and everything. And that was at a very naive stage in like early 2017, when everything to do with self-sovereign identity and decentralized identity, all those ideas are very rudimentary. Still, you know, you just hash a certain identifier and you put that on chain, and then like no one had said like maybe that's a privacy concern and a correlation concern, but everyone was just like very, you know, excited about the potential of these ideas. And we built some early POCs on Ethereum, which was in a time where you didn't have ERC 725, you know, it was just ERC 20s, and we saw, okay, this is a lot more complicated than it should be. When you're talking about people needing to have tokens in their wallet to interact with this, and the UX was really a nightmare, even conceptually. And then you also have the idea of, or at least at the time, of, you know, paying gas to verify credentials and all of that, which also didn't seem like a very good idea. And so then at some point, we saw a group of like-minded people within Sovereign, which had only a couple other stewards at the time. I think we were the ninth when we onboarded in like June 2017, July, something like that. But they'd been working on this concept of self-sovereign identity for a while, and we kind of hooked in on that. We saw, okay, these guys, they've done a lot of work that we thought we still had to do, and so we dove into that, and then Started flying the sovereign flag, SSI flag, and shortly after that started working with the Netherlands Red Cross through the 510 data team, which also for us, what was a very valuable experience in needing to make these things work for people on the ground floor for high stakes situations, which was very valuable into also the perspective of privacy and the implications, not having any perverse incentives, which you also see in certain models. For instance, this is one that's still around. It's like the idea of data marketplaces, where at least in the humanitarian sector, people were pitching this idea of data marketplaces where people, refugees and people who'd been struck by disaster could sell their data, and then they would get money for it, and then they could use that to sustain themselves. And that that sounds good in the sense that, oh, you are empowering people with the power of data, and we are giving all this data away anyway, and our power to the people, they can use this to get financial freedom. But then of course, when you're talking about people who have been put into such a situation, they will of course always sell their data, and that's a perverse incentive in that way, because at that point they don't really have a choice, which doesn't scale very well. So coming face to face with those types of realizations was very good for us early on.
Yeah, I think obviously coming from the crypto space as well, like similar to Tykn, like we had done some early POCs on Ethereum, on some other chains, and it was the same kind of that same problem. Like back in the early days, it's like, yeah, let's just throw everything on here, and like let's disregard anything else. Like yay for immutability, yay for not being able to rewrite data and history. Like, yay, let's go. And then you realize quite quickly, like, yeah, this doesn't work. It doesn't even work for a use case of buying gas or going to buy a bottle of alcohol, right? And so, but it is interesting that people that come from that space, they get decentralized identity, or they get self-sovereign identity, because it's more concept, like the concept, right? Like not necessarily the implementation, the technology, the governance, everything that you could go into, but just conceptually it makes sense. And I think a lot of people that are advocates for crypto, just they get that, right? And so you did give a presentation, I think earlier this year at the North American Bitcoin conference, and I attended that conference in I think December 2017, which was kind of like when ICOs were peaking, and it was it was crazy.
We were there at the same time then. It was probably January 2018 was the Miami one.
Yeah.
Exactly. We were probably there at the same time. Yeah,
it was crazy. Like everyone, and I think they had like I don't know exactly, but there were like close to 100 like presenters at that conference, and half of them were ICO pitches. Like it was unbelievable.
Yeah, that was nuts. We were actually one of the companies presenting, but we weren't presenting an ICO. And so we kind of stood out in that way. We actually had a booth there as well. And it was the conference where we unveiled our collaboration with 510 of the Red Cross, which, was done like the month before. And that's when we unveiled it. But yeah, there was so many ICOs. And I remember the guys next to us. I was there with Khalid. I was like, this doesn't, these guys don't really feel right to me. Like there's just something about how they interact with people. They were very defensive and everything. I was like, this doesn't feel good. And then 2 months later, they were indicted for securities fraud for like $40 million or something.
Oh yeah, I think those classic memes that you see still today in crypto of like there's a guy at a party with a Bitcoin Christmas sweater and a guy with an Ethereum Christmas sweater. That was from around that time, where it was just just pure craziness.
And that was peak madness, right? Because that's when the market had kind of topped the week before ish. And it was just all around, Lambo moon hype madness. And But at the same time, barring those projects, a lot of good things have come out of this as well. And to me, what was exciting around that time is that I looked around and was like, okay, 90% of these projects, it's ridiculous, that these shouldn't exist. And at the same time, I saw that the underlying technology also, it was still so early, and so in a way it was really shitty. There wasn't really much you could do with it. And then to me, that was like, okay, this is still something that's super early, that's still going to evolve a lot. And you could kind of, start to ideate on, okay, what will this look like in 5 to 10 years? And so that in that sense, I've kind of tried to remain optimistic, but also neutral. I can say about a lot of this stuff, okay, this is pure hype, and this is on the short term, that's going to go very wrong. But then also on the long term, there's an element of this that's going to survive. And that element is going to be super interesting. Same with stuff like NFTs. Huge hype. A lot of it doesn't make sense in the sense that it's non-persistent. A lot of this art is hosted on centralized domains, and the tokens themselves just contain pointers to this centralized domain. So if that domain goes down, if some of these marketplace startups shut down in 5-10 years, then your art is gone and your token's worthless. That doesn't make any sense to me. But then, there's this underlying thing of there's some of this art, some of this art that's created, some of it's generative, some not, but that is actually stored on chain, which is a lot more persistent. And then that I then find interesting. It's like, okay, this is some art that is fully persistent, which if we think about how much we are, interacting on Zoom and stuff nowadays, it's not weird to think that in 5 years, we'll get into this metaverse idea. I think Jamie Burke from Outlier Ventures, he wrote about it, the open metaverse, us being just involved in these virtual worlds. And of course, having scarcity there is a good idea, just like in the real world. And then, then that idea becomes kind of appealing. But then at the same time, a lot of it is now it's hype, and it shouldn't really exist. I mean, not that it shouldn't exist, of course, it should, but it doesn't have lasting, persistent value. And yeah.
They all go through the same cycle, right? It's the same thing if you're thinking about the NFTs today as exactly. The ICOs were 3 years ago. Exactly. The properties behind it are amazing. The ability to be able to tokenize and create liquidity around pretty much any type of unique asset is quite interesting. Forget just art, right? And then being able to borrow against it, to lend against it. There's so many cool things you could do with that. So I guess like when you went back to this conference this year, which I guess was virtual this year, you pitched self-sovereign identity to the crypto crowd. Like, how did you approach that?
So I try to approach it from like a pretty neutral point of view of because oftentimes at these conferences, people kind of pitch their own project, or at least chill it, and there's some financial motivation behind it. And also the organizer said, don't do that. Try to keep it informational and educational. And so that's what I try to do. I talked about in a couple of slides, I talked about some of the stuff Tykn's been doing just from like a use case perspective of like, oh, this is, something you can do with it, and this is what we've done. But really trying to just keep it as an explanation of how does this really work from a high level in terms of how credentials flow and data flows, and what hits the underlying ledger and what doesn't. But then you saw in the comments, like already people asking, oh, what's this project? What's the token? Like no token, no ICO, just, tech company building tech stuff.
but by the way, it could bridge a significant gap between institutions and crypto. So you may want to pay attention.
So that I wonder when that's really going to happen. I thought maybe this cycle, this time around, there would be more of like this linkage between the crypto space and SSI space, because they've kind of separated. And I thought maybe, some of these SSI use cases would start to drip into the crypto space, even just for KYC and everything. But now, because of more decentralization in the crypto space with decentralized exchanges and such, you see that actually that demand for KYC is actually becoming less and less. That they're actually moving away from it. So like you have, for instance, Shapeshift. They moved to working with decentralized exchanges.
They were given
To remove
flack,
the
right?
KYC.
Yeah, they were given flack a few years ago when they did
Yeah,
install
yeah,
KYC.
yeah.
Yeah.
So then, is there really demand for that now in the crypto space? I don't know. Maybe by the time where you have to essentially dox all your wallets, then that it might become more interesting. That maybe, yeah, proof that you own certain wallets, that becomes interesting. But so far, I haven't really seen that, which is lightly surprising to me. On the other hand, maybe good, because also, of course, throughout the bear market, blockchain crypto kind of had a bad rep, and it's good that SSI kind of moved itself away from that, which is also it's rational, right? And it was, in my opinion, it was good also to keep, because this is something we experienced as well, because blockchain and that idea of SSI was so strongly connected, that there was a lot of misconceptions, and this was also, journalists writing about us, that they vaguely understood blockchain, and they vaguely understood the premise of SSI, and then the assumption was, okay, so you take someone's identity and you put it on a blockchain, and then it can't be lost anymore, and then it's just there forever, which of course isn't what it is, and that's not a good message to perpetuate. And then we then got flack from people saying like, oh, Tykn's putting personal information on chains. Like, no, that's the opposite of what we do. But and then I would be calling these journalists like, oh, could you please amend this in the article? Thank you for writing about us, but could you please amend this?
Yeah, but people get stuck, eh? Like I see this often. Like as soon as the word blockchain enters someone's mind, they really get stuck and really stuck on blockchain when it actually, like, it's not non-important, but it's not where you should be focusing on when we're talking about decentralized identity or self-sovereign identity. And so if I just go back a little bit in time, like to the founding of Tykn, so you, Khalid, and there was a third person, I believe, which kind of a lot of companies come out of just a real world problem, and it seemed like this one was a perfect example of a real world problem of an early contributor with you guys to the project who basically lost his identity. So do you mind talking through that and how Tykn came about?
Yeah. So that was that was one of the motivations within that. Tay had struggled through this problem himself, being a refugee and coming to the Netherlands, not having a birth certificate or anything to prove. And then as a refugee in the Netherlands, there's certain processes then that you go through, which is a lot of steps. You go through 10, 11 different kinds of interviews with different institutions. You have like this whole sheet of interviews that you go through to establish things like your age and everything. And that he did have, he did have a passport, so he could, still have something to show for. But a lot of it he didn't. And that lack of track record, that did, impede his ability to integrate better and to get access to certain opportunities along the way. And of course, him within these refugee camps, he saw that there were a lot of people who were worse off, who just had nothing to prove about themselves. And maybe from a place of good-natured naivety from our side, we're like, okay, we can solve this. And that, I feel like a lot of companies are born out of that idea of like underestimating how big the problem is. Like, oh, we can do this. and of course, the problem is way bigger than one company could strive to solve. But it did put us on that right track. And for me, what's important and what's always been important is to, at least if we could make some sort of impact on the status quo, to make it better than it is now. Maybe we can't retroactively give billions of people an identifying document. You can't retroactively give someone a birth certificate. But then you can try to help those people to have a higher degree of access to the current systems without needing that document. And so that to me has become an important part of the motivation within Tykn to be able to give that, because of course, there's big regulatory, legal policy implications, and like when you're talking about legal documentation, which is very hard to change, and it will happen, likely, at least that's what I think, that it will happen over time, but that's not something you can change within the time frame of like 5 years. But we have spoken to over the past 4 years. We've spoken a lot with policymakers within different governments, working with different governments, giving awareness sessions with different governments and large institutions, like within the ICRC, IFRC, United Nations, Dutch government, Turkish government, to at least create that awareness and create a discussion. And it's interesting to see that at least on that front already, it's done quite a bit of good. Because what we were talking about at the time was really the far end of the scale for them. The idea of self-sovereignty and coming from a very puristic point of privacy and data control. But then some of the things that really stuck practically were the ideas of things like data minimization, and that there is this looming idea of what do they call it? Surveillance humanitarianism. I think they started calling it, which is it's quite an important, growing to be a more important term and idea.
Is it the opposite of surveillance capitalism?
So it's the idea that by digitizing a lot of these humanitarian aid processes, you are also gathering a lot of data about different people, and which gets at risk of being exposed, and a lot of insights that you get into these populations, which can be dangerous. You've seen it with the Rohingya people, that through the best humanitarian efforts, they became a lot easier to identify. And I don't think that was even a tech problem, but just because of the humanitarian intervention, that suddenly these people, they became very centralized in certain areas. They had these identification cards, and so suddenly they were an easy target for genocide. And that's, of course, on the worst end of the spectrum. But it's also not strange to think, and this is something that we've also seen, that a lot of this tech is being tested in the field, and then with kind of, I don't want to say disregard for privacy, but kind of in putting it on the back burner, in the sense that, coming from the idea of, these people don't have much anyway, they are almost entirely digitally excluded, so it doesn't really matter that much if we don't safeguard their privacy optimally, or just store all their information in a central database, or collect their biometric information. But of course, that scales very poorly, especially when you're talking about sub-Saharan Africa, which is digitizing at lightning speed. That over the course of 20 years, that becomes quite dangerous. And for us, that's why it has that sense of control, data minimization, privacy, that has to be a first building block. And at least seeing that conversation has started flowing over the past couple of years, that's already that makes me feel good, at least, because it's a conversation that we didn't see 4 years ago. And we are definitely, not the only ones that have been pushing this. There's a lot of activists in that space that have been contributing to making that impact. But I have seen it personally, seen that click, once we've explained it, but at least those core principles got stuck somewhere, and actually spurred a conversation like, okay, this is something we have to take seriously. So at least the idea of self-sovereign identity, it can already produce quite a bit of good.
Yeah, and I guess I guess that naive optimism jumping into anything is probably not a bad thing, because if you knew the complexity underneath, you might have stayed away from it, right?
Oh
So
yeah. Oh, for sure. Yeah, I think about that a lot. I was like, if I knew what was coming and what was ahead in 2017, I'd have probably said, you know what, I'm just gonna do something else and just sit on my crypto. And honestly, personally, I would have been better off if I did that. but I have no regrets at all. But we actually talked about it this morning during our stand up. I was like, yeah, if I, because of course, in the beginning we had to bootstrap a lot, before we started raising funds, and even then, we barely paid ourselves out in terms of salary or anything. So I was also compensating for that within crypto, and even through the bear market, it sold a lot. And thinking now, like, oh, I could have probably just, been retired at 25, which I don't think is a good thing. Probably, I don't think.
I think you guys are clearly trying to make social impact here, and it's quite important. So it's kind of like anything that falls outside of that.
Yeah.
It's like, it's nice to think about. Maybe it hurts sometimes to think about it, the missed
Yeah.
opportunities. But like at the
Yeah.
end of the day, yeah.
I don't think about it too much. What we've been doing with Tykn, that's a lot more fulfilling to me, and I wouldn't trade it for a second.
I bet.
So no regrets.
Yeah. So I guess like I always like to when I think about privacy personally, just break it down into just two pieces. One just being control, right? Like the having the ability to control what happens, and then the second piece is just all about transparency, or traceability. That could happen with centralized systems, but it could also happen with decentralized systems as well. So this kind of going back to the early days of Tykn, when you're looking to basically empower people to have control and to have transparency and to own their identity and really give them that. Is that kind of the project that you guys did, which that there was an announcement, I think earlier this year, with the Turkish government? Was that along the same lines?
Exactly. Yeah, we put that press release out, I think a couple of weeks ago now, which is a project that we started, at least in research conceptual phase, in 2019. So we took part in this UN Turkish government-led accelerator for identity companies, to tackle some of the aspects of the refugee crisis. So Turkey has taken in a lot of Syrian refugees, and they want them to integrate into society. And of course, there's a lot of different facets to different problems within that whole sphere. So we went to Turkey multiple times. We went from Istanbul to Gaziantep, which is very close to the border. Gaziantep, I believe, from the 2.5 million people that live there, 500,000 are refugees. And surprisingly little are still in refugee camps. So they've put in a lot of effort to be able to integrate them into society. And we went there with a bunch of assumptions. Again, a certain degree of naivete of, they have this temporary protection card, and we know that is hard for them to move across different geographical areas and to do certain things, because they need to get this card updated, and sometimes they don't have the mobility. So what we're going to do is, we'll just digitize that card for them, because we knew that smartphone penetration was very high amongst the refugee population, a lot higher than people assume. It's about 94-95%. A lot of families have multiple devices, iPhone, iPad, a lot of Apple products. So we thought, okay, we'll just digitize this temporary protection card, and that's job done. They can receive the money on their phone, and they can update it remotely, etc., etc. And once we actually got to talk to the refugees on the ground floor, and the people around that, so from people from government to local NGOs to United Nations, we tried to talk with everyone, and we saw that actually didn't even come close to being the actual most pressing issue. They were like, oh yeah, this card is annoying because it's like piece of plastic that's just a bit too big to put in your pocket. That's annoying, but I don't really care about that. Like I have bigger things to worry about. Like I I can't really get a job on paper. My 8-year-old daughter is working full time in a textile factory for 30 euros a month. And those were really heavy and shocking conversations, as they always are. They're very important to have, just to be able to. I had a conversation with a colleague about this. The difference between knowing and understanding. That you can know a lot of these facts and read them from reports and articles and see it on the news, and understanding we probably never will, because we've never had to go through those experiences. But at least we can approximate understanding once you have those conversations face to face. And when you sit at the table with people and they tell you their 8-year-old daughter is working almost full time in a textile factory. And so we then started to look and think about this, and we saw that one of the pain points was that there's this work permit application process that employers need to go through in order to employ a refugee. And this process is a bit cumbersome, quite long usually. And what often happens is that the employer passes this process on to an accountant. And the thing is that you have to pay an initial fee for this work permit, and then you have to pay a recurring fee. And then the accountant also charges a markup. And the way that the accountant also does this application process is that the employer basically gives their information from their from their portal. So basically their government identity portal login information they give to the accountant, which also has a lot other information
we're
behind
not
it.
even getting into that.
Yeah. It's not very prudent. And then accountant charges a surplus on top of it. And then what we saw is that, and this is not very legal, but what was happening a lot is that these costs were being passed on to the refugee. So that the cost of this work permit was passed on to the refugee. And then we kind of started working it out, and we're like, okay, so for a refugee, oftentimes they end up with less money if they actually work on paper. And that, of course, is a huge disincentive to work when you know you can still get your emergency social credit every month, and work under the table and get paid more because you need to sustain your family. And so we said, okay, so maybe we shouldn't work with the refugees directly, but maybe we should focus on this part with the employers. And if we make this work permit application process easier for them to do, then it would give more incentive to hire refugees, and they would be the main ultimate, at least social benefactor. And the UN really liked that idea. The Turkish government really liked that idea. So we started working that out with Anna, our product, and we ran a pilot in that in Istanbul with the Istanbul Chamber of Commerce, INGEV, a local NGO, Ministry of Labor, and essentially made it super easy for an employer to receive a certificate of business ownership, and then use that with a statement from an accountant to be able to apply for a work permit within the application. And so now this pilot was received very well, and it's now escalated to the top of the presidency office, where we're now talking about, okay, how can we move this forward within the digital transformation framework. And Turkey is very advanced in terms of the digital infrastructure. This is something that, for some reason, is not on a lot of people's radar. But for instance, TÜBİTAK, which is the research arm of the Turkish government, they were working on indie wallets and sovereign test network since 2019, 2018. Which you know, a lot of other governments they're not even thinking about it now, and they were already looking at that 3 years ago. So in that sense, they are very much quite advanced, and that's why it's also been such a pleasure to work with them, because they know, you know, they already know everything. And I remember meeting their chief researcher, and it was at a UN function somewhere in Ankara, and I was talking to someone else. I was talking about SSI and kind of trying to obscure the terminology a bit to make it easier to understand, more like an explain like I'm five. And the guy just came over and was like, "Hey, are you talking about self-sovereign identity? Are you talking about sovereign? Because then we need to talk." I was like, yeah, absolutely. Which was a really nice moment. So yeah, that's still something that's ongoing now.
It's nice when you could skip kind of that education part when people are
Yeah.
already sold on that. You're like, okay, we could actually now focus on like what the economics are, what the business case is. And it seems like going on the ground there really helped you guys understand the dynamics within that ecosystem to figure out how the economics work, because that's the crucial piece to figure out if you're going to make anything work, right? And I guess another key piece too, and I know you guys put a lot of focus on UX and design as a company. So there are lots of conversations happening around design in the SSI space, just around wallets, more specifically of like, how do you internationalize wallets? It's more than just having a switch that you flip the language. People use things differently in different countries, and I'm sure that was noticeable as well in Turkey or with Syrian refugees, just how they use technology, right? And then even the intricacies within the apps, how you can make it just a better experience to get more engagement, to get more usage and stuff like that.
Absolutely.
And so, do you mind just talking a bit about the importance that you guys place on that, and then how it's kind of resulted in Anna and in, I know we've talked before about just cloud products and browser products. And so how does that all kind of tie together for you guys?
Oh yeah. It's a shame. It's a shame Glaude isn't here, because he's the chief UXer. But there's some huge things that we've seen in that, and that for us was very valuable in terms of learning, because then we went from like a lot of other SSI companies being a bunch of geeks working on the whiteboard to, you know, actually having to speak with people and understand, you know, if we built this, could you use it? And the answer oftentimes in the beginning was no. and then you find out across, like you said, across population groups, you know, there's a lot of user experience assumptions that we make nowadays, a lot of things that are very intuitive and natural for us now, because there's certain products that we've been using, digital products that we've been using for the past 10 years, and they have certain interactions that are just completely logical to us, like filling out a form, scrolling, having a back and a next button, you know, all those things. It seems very natural to us, but it isn't inherently it isn't to a lot of other population groups. And then when you actually go to test those designs, you see people get stuck. And something we saw, within the Syrian refugee population, you know, they are a lot more tech savvy. You know, Syria, it wasn't, you know, like I said, a lot of them just they have iPads, they have iPhones. There's a technologically advanced society. So they understand those interactions a lot more, and there isn't as much of a gap. But then some of the design work, you know, for instance, with the Red Cross, you did see people who, for whom it wasn't per se intuitive to having to scroll and fill out certain forms, and so you really have to think about, okay, how can I make this as intuitive as possible? And that also inspired some of the designs for Anna, in that what we did see is that and this probably won't come as a big surprise, but a service or product that is just used almost ubiquitously across population groups is WhatsApp and Facebook. And so even people who didn't understand any other apps or any other whatever, they understood WhatsApp, they understood texting people, they understood Facebook and Facebook groups and everything. But a lot of other things that sometimes were just very abstract and didn't quite uh, didn't quite ring globally. So some of the things within Anna, we try to make it seem like it's a WhatsApp flow when you go through certain parts of the onboarding, for instance. And this was the same with one-to-one, which is what the Red Cross project ultimately ended up being called, one-to-one for cash-based aid. And as, from an SSI perspective, we took a lot of learnings from that as well, because we came face to face with some of the realities of having to go into the field and having it make it useful for people. And then we saw pretty early that the puristic view of SSI in terms of having everything stored on edge wallets and everything, when you go to somewhere in sub-Saharan Africa, that's going to be pretty difficult. When there's maybe one phone in a village, and it doesn't even necessarily, it's not even necessarily a smartphone, and then it's very easy to say, oh yeah, but within SSI everything has to be stored on the edge wallet. And but then what we saw was, okay, you can make that as this hard requirement and keep working from that, but then all these population groups are just going to be left behind more and more. And then for those cases, perhaps it makes more sense to take some of those qualities of SSI in terms of having a higher degree of control, and being able to guard that and have these guardianship models and everything, whilst the information isn't per se stored locally. So allowing them to, for instance, using a feature phone, which is what we've been working on, being able to accept credentials and verify credentials using a feature phone, which is inherently needs some sort of cloud infrastructure. So it's, the credential obviously isn't stored on the feature phone on the edge in that case. But that does open up a lot of these interactions and use cases to these population groups. And also it is better than the status quo, which is also something, that we feel strongly about, is, perhaps it's not in the puristic sense, pure SSI, but it is a lot better than the status quo. And there's, as long as you take account of certain things, of not having that degree of correlation, still having that degree of privacy, operating from a starting point of user control. If you take those into account, data minimization as well, they still have the portability. So starting from that point of view, it is a lot better still than the status quo. And that's important to be able to see that nuance across different sectors also within SSI, because we've also seen it from the other side, where within enterprises, that they didn't especially want to have something pure SSI because they wanted to get certain insights. That's not something, that's a popular idea within SSI for good reason, I think, because that's something we ultimately want to move away from.
Which by the way, for business reasons or for regulatory reasons, it's not a reason, like there's no reason why data cannot be kind of received and stored and used. But I think back to just what you're saying here too about kind of the removing certain correlation, minimizing the data, ensuring the user control and the transparency and the different privacy properties and all of the other principles we live by. As long as that's kind of built into the architecture of what you're doing, if you want to do business with a bank or with an employer and they need certain information, well, it's up to you to opt into it.
Yeah, opt in and be able to opt out as well, which is of course also important. And that is what's important to me within SSI as well, that GDPR and everything, good that we can request our data back and request it to be forgotten and everything. But I don't know about you, but I don't have a list anywhere of companies that have my data or that I've interacted with. So even being able to have that and having a nuke button that says, okay, opt out of all of these, that would already be pretty great. And I think things like that will become a lot easier because of at least the principles of SSI within the next 5 years or so. And then ultimately maybe it'll even become a requirement in that sense.
I like what you said about the using back to the consumer side, just taking into consideration messaging inside of the user experience. Like messaging is the killer application of mobile technology. Like there's nothing more used than that. So I love that. Hey, like this makes sense to literally everyone in the world. If you could try to incorporate a bit of these digital credentials or stuff that you're doing within a messaging kind of experience, it's kind of very intuitive and makes sense and doesn't force someone to learn something new or get used to using something new. It's just kind of easy.
Which is something we need to build on, right? I mean, I think we've all become very excited about SSI because of its potentially disruptive properties. And you kind of start ideating about, what would society look like if it in like a perfect utopia where this is the norm, and then you have the ones that go a step further and they're like, oh, maybe we don't even need governments anymore because we could just attest to our own existence. And but then at the end of the day, if you build something that's so completely different and that the regular person will just not understand how to even use it or why I would want that. Like a lot of people are like, oh, but I trust my government, or like, oh, but I trust my bank. Like why would I want to step away from, like, you still see it in crypto, it's like, oh, I don't feel comfortable with that. I like having everything in my bank. And that's super logical. But I think also working with an SSI becomes very easy to have your nose to the whiteboard and forget that there's other people out there who aren't as intimately familiar with the technology, its propositions, and the kind of ideology around it. And a lot of people, they just want things to work smoother. And perhaps as a secondary, they want to be less at risk. This is something that we've also seen, that a lot of SSI companies like us in the beginning, a lot of what we were saying was based around privacy and security. And that, to a lot of people, isn't really an appealing value proposition, because that assumption is baked in. It's baked in to a lot of products. When you use your bank, like, oh, I assume, with all these regulations and stuff, and it's a bank, I assume it's just all good. It's all secure and private until proven otherwise. And for a lot of people, it's never proven otherwise. A lot of people don't get their identity stolen. So they're like, I'll be fine. And that's kind of the paradox. I think in the Netherlands, they did some research on it, that there's this privacy paradox of people, everyone's concerned about their privacy, but no one necessarily takes the proper actions to ensure that degree of privacy and online security, and even things like password management. I still meet people who have no idea that they shouldn't reuse passwords. And these are, people, my age, and they just have no idea why that would be risky, and so that's something that we have to consider as well. When you put this out there, that a lot of people, they just want things to go smoother, and they don't necessarily have a strong opinion on how that happens. A lot of people don't understand why in some cases biometrics and what's happening in China, why that's necessarily bad. That's taken quite a lot of education of the tail risks of implementing something like that, of having all your biometrics in a central database that can be accessed by governments and who else. And they just see like, oh, but wouldn't it be great to just like walk through the airport and they scan your face and you get on the plane? Like, yeah, from a user experience point of view, that would be pretty great. But then from a point of view of privacy and security, maybe not.
Yeah, and then on the other side, we laugh every time we ask a company we're talking to about their security. No, we hash our data and we do this, and
Exactly.
it's quite funny, right? But to your point here, like it comes down to just the lowest friction and the most utility, right? Like I think I saw numbers the other day. Like today, there's 2.8 billion people that use Facebook products,
Yeah. Jeez.
but like they're awesome to a lot of people. And like,
Yeah.
why would they not want to use them? There's so much utility to it.
And I mean, and that is also a point, right? That it's really hard to get away from that grip now. But it's also, even if I think about it myself, and I'm like, I still have a Facebook profile just because, like, my grandparents, for instance, have a Facebook profile, and like, especially now, because my grandfather's pretty sick, and like the only way, like, for him, it's magic. It's magic that he can see me and my sister in the UK and my parents in Spain, and we can all see him at the same time while he's like in in bed. Like, that to him, it's magical, and like, to me, that's also, that's huge. And so it does bring a lot of good things to people's lives, and a lot of people don't. But then, they don't understand the potential risks of having that power, within Facebook. And it's already, we're talking briefly about things like the open metaverse in the future. And Facebook is already like making a big bet on that with Oculus and all these other devices, that you will need a Facebook account to use that. And so they're already extending that control, which in the long term is, it's very scary. But a lot of people don't inherently care about that because they just want to receive that utility, which is logical.
Yeah, and for sure. And so I guess, like, just to close this, like, while we're having these utopian conversations about self-sovereign identity and how everything's going to be on the edge, everyone's going to own their keys, everyone's going to own their credentials. It's similar conversations if we jump back on the crypto side, right?
Yeah.
But it's kind of like, yes, we want to have the right principles baked in, but by the way, over the past decade, the rise of both cloud and mobility and connectivity have created just so much usability, so much utility, has lowered friction for so many things that you kind of have to use these things, right? So like, and again, to your point earlier about, still interacting with banks and stuff. Banks are custodians of your money, of your fiat money.
Yeah.
Right. And they do, like, there's a lot of issues with banks, but they do provide very valuable services. And so the same thing should be true for when we talk about identity and credentials and stuff like that. Like, you're crazy to think that people are going to store their credentials on an edge wallet, just like the maximalists store their crypto on an edge wallet. Like, that's such a small percentage of the population, and it doesn't work, right? And so it's just, how do you bake in the right principles that we're advocating into kind of existing models that augment them? That it's not like we're jumping from 20% to 100%, but we're jumping from 20 to 25, and we have some goals to get to 30, and keep improving that.
Yeah,
so I love what you guys are doing and how you guys are thinking about that with your product suite and your vision for the future.
We're totally aligned on that. I think, ultimately, like you said, it's a very kind of, puristic view that's come from the crypto space, where it's natural and you have to kind of, manage your own keys, really, unless you want to keep it on a centralized exchange, which historically hasn't gone very well. So then you have these hardware wallets, and where you store it essentially on the edge, or at least, your keys. And that is for a regular user, that's not going to fly. It's not going to happen. Even I have to persuade friends and family who are now diving head first in crypto, of course, because things are at all-time high, and then I just kind of have to persuade them to spend 80 euros on a hardware wallet, so that it's not on an exchange, and they're not at risk of huge loss. And so, when you have something like that, and but storing it in something like MetaMask, they already find that more comfortable. Now, ideally, you would use MetaMask with a hardware wallet, so you could have it in your browser, but you can still sign it with your hardware wallet, your physical wallet. And so that also, I think, for identity, something like that will need to happen, where at least I can sign it with my phone, perhaps, but that a lot of it is just browser based, and that even for some different use cases, and I think we talked about this last time too, in terms of the different stakes and levels of assurance needed for some certain use cases, you wouldn't even need to sign it off. But that, I would love it if a 1Password, for instance, would be able to integrate verifiable credentials, and that I would just use my 1Password and be able to access all these services that way, which in a way you could say, okay, that defeats the point of decentralization and everything. And but for a lot of use cases, that makes a lot more sense. And there's also, there's so much nuance in this, because it's such a new space. And I think we've only seen the tip of the iceberg of what this, the change that this technology will provoke. That I think, for instance, your diploma, we use our diploma to maybe get access to certain job opportunities, and you prove that, oh, here's my diploma, I've put in the work and I've done it. But then what we mostly use it for is signaling. We put that stuff on our LinkedIn. Same with our job history. I might use an employment statement to get a mortgage or something, but mostly it's on my LinkedIn for signaling. And that's something that I want to be public information, and what most of us want to be public information. So then, we should have an option to make certain credentials public. I should have the power myself to turn that off and make it private again. I should have the option to not disclose that to anyone at all. But then I also should have the option to make that public. And a lot of those things, it's still relatively new. And we're only just thinking about this. Same with peer-to-peer stuff, peer-to-peer credentials. I started thinking about that as well when it was my girlfriend from Canada, and she was saying that in Canada, you probably know more about this than I do, but that in Canada, if you want to get a new passport, you need to get a bunch of people from your circles to attest that you exist. You need to get like 5 people or something to say like, oh yeah, I know Mathieu, he's my brother, or he's my colleague, or he's my friend, he's my neighbor, for you to be able to get a new passport. And that, of course, for things like peer-to-peer credentials would be quite interesting. And then so many other uses that we haven't even thought of now. So yeah, I think also within that nuance, we're going to see a lot of, just billion-dollar companies spinning up just within these like little corners, which is what excites me about SSI, because it's still so new. It's so young still. It's so early relative to what it will look like 10 years from now.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I would love to have a further conversation with you. There's a bunch of other stuff we could talk about. I think the whole concept of using verifiable credentials for signaling is quite a funny one. If you look ahead, so that's quite good, and I love that idea. And I also just down the peer-to-peer kind of credential, it's just you start talking about the value of relationships, right? And just how that could start building up. So I think we could go on for a long time on these subjects. But Jimmy, I want to thank you so much for doing this with me today.
Yeah,
it was
thank you for having me
pleasure.
On. Yeah, it was really, really nice. Maybe we do need to have a part 2 someday.
Yeah, let's plan for that. Thank you for listening. Hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as I did. To stay up to speed with future episode releases, please subscribe to the podcast on whatever channel you're listening to it right now. If you have any questions or comments, please reach out to me directly. You can find me online. I'm quite active on LinkedIn and Twitter, so I look forward to hearing from you. See you all next time.